He is a New York Times bestselling author. He is the sports editor of The Nation magazine, and he is the host of the Edge of Sports podcast. And I happen to own one of the copies of his. Is it 10 books, Dave Zirin, as we welcome you in on Sportsnet?
It's 10 books. Yes, sir. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you with us. I guess I should also mention that Gregg Popovich has you on his speed dial too, right? Is that the way it goes?
Coach Pop did call me the other night at midnight to express some feelings and concerns about how things are going in these United States of America. Yes.
So I know Pop likes his red wine, and I know Pop likes his quality red wine. I'm assuming that it was he'd sampled a little. What stood out most from that conversation, the real conversation the two of you guys had?
The number one thing that stands out that was difficult to communicate in the interview that we published at The Nation was the tone underneath his words. I've hung out with Coach Pop on several occasions, and he has kind of an avuncular approach in that, you know, he likes laughing, he likes busting beans a little bit, he likes sort of slapping people on the back, he likes asking questions about how you're doing. He's a very curious person. And this time he was upset. Like, it would even be wrong to call him angry, because it's not really anger, it's upset. Like, he sees that there is a problem in this country, in the United States, that is deeply systemic, that we have a systemic racism problem in the United States. But he's also incredibly frustrated by the fact that the person leading this country, Donald Trump, is not only incapable of trying to have a conversation to lead us out of this morass that we're in, but is actively making it worse, that he's in effect putting out a fire with gasoline. And I think that's what Coach Pop wanted to communicate above all else. He'd been silent longer than a lot of folks in the sports world. And I think I don't know this for sure, but I think he was waiting for the Spurs to make a statement as a team. But the Spurs were one of the last teams to say anything, along with the New York Knicks, the only teams in the NBA to not have said something. So I also got the feeling that he was frustrated that nothing had come from his organization. So even though he didn't say that, but I got the feeling that that was the case. And so he just, decided to let it loose, blazing about his feelings about Donald Trump, about his feelings about the state of this country, about the feelings about racism in the United States, and about how changing our situation, we need leadership as a precondition for doing that. And there is no leadership right now in this country.
Yeah, no, it's a very fair, valid, accurate point. You mentioned San Antonio and New York. As of mid-afternoon Thursday Eastern time, neither the Dallas Cowboys nor the Cincinnati Bengals on the NFL side had issued anything either. Dave, you're in a unique position because stick to sports seems to have, for the last 5 years, seems to be the mantra so many use when it comes to trying to speak about anything that is uncomfortable, has to do with politics, has to do with race, and that's intertwined in modern day athletics. And yet, sticking to sports includes all of those things. And you mentioned the systemic issues in racism and police, and obviously that will bring us back to Colin Kaepernick, because that's when this thing really took on, in my opinion, a life of its own in this era and in this generation. Do you think in the aftermath of George Floyd and what's happening now, the stick to sports mantra may go away? Or are we going, or will society forget about this again down the road when they get distracted by the next news story?
No, I think actually that we've reached a point where we're going to be with this for a while, trying to figure this out, and that athletes are going to be part of leading that discussion. If
Hallelujah.
I could, I'd love to read a quote to you from Howard Bryant of something that he said to me, the author who wrote the book Full Dissident. He's an ESPN author. Can I read you this quote? Because it sums up some of what I'm thinking about your question. Howard said, and I'm reading it off my screen, he said, "The kneeling gesture is the spot where America comes apart, where all the post 9/11 pro-police messaging and militarism at sporting events collides with the reality of the police and the military. In no other element of our culture is there such a clear and defiant single gesture like taking a knee. Where else are we allowed the space to say we disagree with our police? Where else can we register with one gesture the dissent with the alleged ideals of this country? America is getting called out with this one gesture, and they are determined to punish anyone using it. See, I think that's what the point is. I mean, Colin Kaepernick might be the individual who first put that knee to the ground, but I've spent the last month interviewing high school and college athletes who also took a knee in their communities during the anthem for this book I'm working on, and they experienced what Colin experienced, just on a much smaller level. Like, they experienced harassment, they experienced threats to be kicked off their team, they experienced death threats over social media. I mean, and we're talking about small communities, large communities, athletes who played volleyball, soccer, cheerleaders, not even just necessarily football. So what we're fighting for right now is a space to actually criticize policing in the United States, and athletes. And that one gesture of taking a knee, I would argue, is the lever that's opening up that space where there was not a space before.
What I never understood was why what Kaepernick was doing would always get deflected.
Yes.
This was never about the flag, and it was never about the military. And if anybody knew that, it was Drew Brees.
Mm-hmm.
Because Drew Brees was employed with the New Orleans Saints, employed in an NFL locker room where all walks of life exist, from different backgrounds, from all over, and the conversations were being had. And that's not me saying that. That was Pat McAfee earlier today on his radio show, who happens to be white, who is part of the Punters or People Too movement, but he still existed in that locker room then. And he said Drew Brees would have known that the conversation wasn't about, the conversations being had, the points that he was hearing that his teammates were saying was not about the military and was not about the flag. And yet he made the decision on Wednesday to go down that road.
Mm-hmm.
Dave, in your mind, why would he do that?
I think because there are a couple of reasons. The first is that for so long in this country, I mean, and we're going back decades upon decades, wrapping yourself in the flag was the way to deflect all criticism.
Of course.
If you wanted to, I mean, and in the United States, I think it's particularly sharp. You don't see this. Like, I have friends in Great Britain who are said to me, you don't hear about people wrapping themselves in the Union Jack. It's not the same thing. It's not the same dynamic. There's something very particular about nationalism in the United States, where people think that if you wrap yourself in the flag, you'll all of a sudden be immune from all criticisms. And we've moved beyond that in the last week. And I think Drew Brees was just behind the curve as to where we are as a country right now. Now, who knows if we'll stay there? And that goes to your previous question. Who knows if we're going to be able to keep up this momentum and keep pushing forward? But Drew Brees found himself in a position that he did not expect to be in, but it was a position that he put himself in because he made the decision to put himself out there as the person who is going to say, no, we still shouldn't be taking a knee because we shouldn't disrespect the flag and we shouldn't disrespect our country, as if that was what this was about. And I think that's why people were so upset with him, is that, Colin took that knee 4 years ago. It was August 2016, for goodness sakes. And the idea that in that time, maybe one could be forgiven in 2016 for saying, wait a minute, you're disrespecting the flag, you're disrespecting the troops. But you've had 4 years to listen. You've had 4 years to hear people say over and over and over again, this is not about the flag or the troops. This is about a dissenting position on police violence. This is about the gap that exists between what that flag promises and the lived experiences of Black people in the United States. That's what the knee is about. And that Drew still wasn't able to not only hear that, but synthesize that into his thoughts and express some semblance of understanding of what people have been saying for 4 years. It speaks to a couple of things. I mean, it speaks to, I think, the blindness that the privileges of race, of income, and of fame can produce on a person. It also speaks to the privileges that exist, I would argue, with the quarterback position in the NFL. I mean, anybody who's been in a locker room knows that, the quarterback, they have their own meetings, they have their own coach. It's very rare in the NFL that a quarterback is actually elected to be the player rep of their individual team. And it's interesting. I do believe that Brees in the past has been the player rep of the New Orleans Saints. He has accrued a lot of respect and leadership there, but there still is that distance between the quarterback and the rank and file members, if you will, of the team itself. And I think Drew Brees got a very, very rude awakening as to that fact when even his own star receiver, Michael Thomas, tells him that he needs to shut his mouth and leave the room. I mean, in the response by Malcolm Jenkins, I mean, the avalanche, LeBron James, of course, but I was much more intrigued by the avalanche of comments from actual NFL players, that there wasn't any kind of, shall we say, thin blue line, for lack of a better term, that there wasn't like everybody coming together behind the shield and saying, we don't criticize our own, especially a player of Brees's prominence. No, people were just fed up. And Drew Brees became, in a lot of respects, I think, that symbol for all these players, of people in leadership in the NFL, whether coaches or quarterbacks, general managers, or franchise owners, who continue to not get it and seem to be willingly not getting it, seem to be proudly blind, proudly deaf to the concerns that exist right now among Black players in the National Football League.
Yeah, and Dave, when you speak to the divide between the quarterback position and everybody else in rank and file, it's important to understand you mean, for the most part, economics. A guy like Drew Brees, a guy like Kirk Cousins, these quarterbacks who have signed the big contracts, Patrick Mahomes is about to, they are making $20, $30 million more per year, more than the majority of each of the players in that locker room.
Yeah. And so it's a question of economics. It's also a question, and obviously this connects with economics, of job security.
Of course.
When I did the book with Michael Bennett, NFL player, defensive lineman, he said to me that with his friends in the league, they say that NFL stands for either not for long or N-word for lease. So a typical player, you're there and then you're gone. You're basically there to fill a locker room spot. But who's there year in, year out? If you're a stable team and a good team, it's the quarterback and the quarterback position. And so with that, with great power comes great responsibility. I mean, with that comes, I think, from a lot of players, the expectation, particularly Black athletes, that this quarterback actually is going to listen to their concerns. I mean, all the rhetoric about how we're all a big family and, in the locker room, and to have him say something like that, I mean, it was like just an absolute slap in the face.
So let's go back to just shy of 3 years ago. It was October of 2017, and Cam Newton made a mistake. He said it was funny to hear a female talk about routes when a female reporter asked him about something to do with wide receivers. I think it was Devin Funchess or something like that, and what they were doing on the field. Immediately, a national yogurt company dropped him, and I believe it was in and around a $3 million annual endorsement sponsorship that Cam had at the time. That's 2017. Now, Dave, we fast forward to June of 2020, and I looked up Drew Brees' endorsements. They include Nike, Procter & Gamble, Pepsi-Cola, and Wrangler. Massive national companies. I have not seen one of those corporations speak out against Brees, nor have I seen them drop him.
Agreed. I mean, this is part of the problem right now. And I think it relates to the whole issue of the corporations doing, blacking out their Twitter accounts and putting out these messages. And when I look at those messages, the words I look for are police, violence, and George Floyd. And the overwhelming majority of these messages, they have words instead like listening and they say racism, but it's usually in the context of we will all try to do better, and we are here at Coca-Cola committed to X, Y, and Z. And it's what you want to see is action. You want to see the words matched with deeds. And I think that that Drew Brees is going to skate on this is actually an example of how, for a lot of these corporations, it has much to do with what they call on Madison Avenue woke marketing, and this idea of trying to connect with this younger generation of people in this country than it has to do with an actual commitment to any sort of racial justice or reconciliation.
Words meet deeds in Detroit. Pistons head coach Dwayne Casey, along with some of the players and staff who were in town in Detroit during the COVID crisis. They were downtown today. We're filming this on Thursday, the 4th of June. They went to march, starting at police headquarters, beginning at 4 o'clock. Dwayne Casey has spoken out about this. He was on our network on Wednesday. He sent out a statement over the weekend. People in Canada, especially Toronto, know him. Casey led the Raptors to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2016. So we talk about words and we talk about actions. What can it mean to have the head coach of an NBA franchise go do this, be a part of the demonstrations, Dave?
Oh, it's huge. It's absolutely huge, and it's huge for a couple of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, it's huge because professional athletes and coaches, when they've had the opportunity to be coaches, are the most prominent Black employees in the United States. So, we're not talking about, mega mogul music stars. We're not talking, about other aspects of culture or entertainment. We're not talking about politicians. We're talking about people who actually work and are part of a union and are part of a collective organization of people. They are the most prominent people who've had a microphone and have been since the days of Jack Johnson. And that's why that platform has been policed so aggressively over the last 100 years. Like why Black athletes have this platform, but then they're told you better use that platform only to promote products or say salute the red, white, and blue, or you're going to find yourself without that platform, without the fame, without the wealth, without all the privileges that come with it. And so when you have someone like Dwayne Casey say, well, actually, I'm going to go to the demonstration, I mean, that marks a cultural shift. And of course, it's not just Dwayne Casey. I mean, Stephen Jackson, who knew George Floyd, has been on the front lines of these demonstrations. Karl Anthony Towns, just a couple of months after losing his mother to COVID, has been at these demonstrations. Marcus Smart has been at these demonstrations. Jaylen Brown traveled to Georgia to be at a demonstration. A former NBA player, Royce White, has been leading demonstrations. And that's the second point that's so important about their presence actually on the ground. And by the way, I named just a few. There are many more I could name of athletes who've been at these demos.
Right.
It's also important because the last time you saw anything like this in the United States was 1967 and 1968. And in those days, it was actually very common to see athletes deployed, sometimes actually in their sports uniforms, to demonstration hotspots as a way to quell people's anger and calm people down. They were standing against the tide, usually put there as a way to keep people from protesting. And in some cases, like on college campuses, the athletes were actively hostile to the protesters. Not uncommon to see athletes form picket lines around occupied buildings to keep food and water from getting inside. And so to have a situation like this right now where athletes aren't just, standing on the side, but are actually trying to be a part of the movement itself, and people like Dwayne Casey doing what he's doing in a city like Detroit with its history, I mean, marks a huge cultural shift. In fact, one of the most famous examples of what I was just talking about athletes being deployed was in 1967. You had practically an insurrectionary situation in Detroit at that time, and Willie Horton, the star first baseman of the Tigers, was out there in his Tigers uniform trying to calm folks down. And they actually have a statue of that in Detroit to commemorate it. And now to have Dwayne Casey actually marching with folks, I mean, that's just a huge shift.
And let's hope Dwayne Casey is the first of many to follow, to do it. We saw many athletes type words. We saw many athletes and organizations post black boxes the other day. Let's hope they do more, and let's hope they have actions behind their words.
Indeed.
Dave, we appreciate the time. You can find Dave Zirin as the sports editor of The Nation magazine. He hosts the Edge of Sports podcast. He's written 10 books, and Gregg Popovich always passes along his wine recommendations to Dave, too. So
I can't afford them, but sure.
No kidding. Makes two of us. Dave, appreciate the time, man.
Thank you.